because you're here today, I'm assuming you are already interested in open science, that you don't necessarily need too much convincing about why you should be applying open science practices. So I'm going to get real practical and talk about some benefits of for your own career about why you should be applying open science practices for your research, particularly in the context of clinical research, and also walking through a really cool tool as to how you can share your data. A really big issue at the moment within open science or within science in general is data sharing. And quite often you'll hear people going, oh, you should just share your data, it'll be fine. But these are the people who are working within fields like psychophysics, where it doesn't necessarily matter whether you're sharing this personal information because it's not really identifiable. But if you're working within clinical data, which is what I do, then of course there are important considerations for sharing potentially personally identifiable information. So I'm going to show you a really cool tool which allows you to share your data so other people can reproduce it while maintaining the privacy of your research participants. So let's jump in. I'm going to give you a very, very quick overview as to my perspective, where I'm coming from, and why I'm interested in open science and reproducible science. As Annalena mentioned, I do a lot of work within oxytocin research, particularly understanding what this neuropeptide actually does and its function in mental health and physical health. And I've done a bit of work looking at gene expression within the brain, within the oxytocin pathway, but also the effects of intranasal oxytocin administration. When we administer oxytocin and increase oxytocin levels in the brain, how does this influence cognition and behavior? And to give an example, we've found some really promising findings looking at how oxytocin administration modulates social cognition within autism, but also within neurotypical participants. But it hasn't always been this way. Oxytocin, as you may be aware, has been subject to a hype cycle. Any sort of technology out there. One great example right now is self-driving cars. Originally, there's a bit of early research or a bit of early technology saying this is going to be really great. Then there's a lot of hype, that everyone's going to be using. It's going to be fantastic. And then there's a bit of disillusionment where the actual reality doesn't actually suit the expectations. And then you begin to recalibrate your understanding of what this new technology can do. And oxytocin has been the same. What started with a lot of promise with animal research went to a lot of hype where people were thinking this could potentially treat every single psychiatric illness out there, to a lot of disappointment where a lot of stuff didn't replicate. And then eventually we're getting better understanding of its limits. And that's where my research comes in. But when I started my PhD, it was almost at this peak where everyone was thinking this is going to be fantastic. So my interest in open science came from this frustration of being in a field where a lot of stuff wouldn't replicate. And that's what started with all the work that I've been doing in meta science and ways that we can actually improve research practices. So I've done a fair bit of work looking at this on how we can actually improve statistical inference, how we can share anonymized data sets, and a lot of other work as well, looking at ways that we can actually improve research within oxytocin research, but also research within medicine and psychology in general. Okay, so that's a bit of a background. Look, there are so many potential slides that I can show you to illustrate the current problems with reproducibility in psychology and in medicine, but I think this one is probably the best one out there. This is a funnel plot, which is often presented with meta-analysis when you are combining effect sizes from a whole field of work. And so what we've got here is the field studies, or the black studies are basically the studies that have been published without pre-registration. And you can see that almost every single study is hovering around that 0.05 significance line. But then when different researchers have tried to replicate this particular research field, the replication studies all hovered around 0, away from this magic significance line. So you can see it's almost magic what happens when you begin to pre-register studies, in that the effects seem to shrink and get quite a lot smaller, and not as many of these studies actually get close to this significance line. So this has happened time and time again in different research fields, that without open science and without pre-registration, These things can inflate effect sizes and also bias what gets published. Because as we know, unfortunately, this is changing a little bit, but unfortunately, studies which are not statistically significant tend not to get published, and studies that are tend to get published. But these effect sizes tend to be inflated. So there's a big issue there. I want to cover two of the many benefits of open science. And the first one is I believe it's better for your research career. It's better for science, which is great, which is which is what we're all doing. But I think these two things aren't mutually exclusive. And by applying open research practices, it's better for you, but it's also better for science in general. Now, the traditional publication framework, how things are done, you spend years planning and writing your papers, and you send it to editors and you send it to peer reviewers, for which it'll get some feedback, probably get rejected, or you might have to do a revise and resubmit. And it can take a long time. If you're very, very lucky, if it's very, very quick, maybe if you have a COVID paper, for instance, 3 months or 6 months, you can get your paper out there. And this has been the model for quite a long time for how we actually get science out there. But this closed door model is very, very slow. It can take a very long time for research to get to other scientists, but also to the public. And the public is the ones who are actually funding our research. I think it's almost a moral imperative that we share our research as soon as possible. But it takes a very long time to get our research out there. But fortunately, in the last few years, now with open science in combination with social media, there is a much quicker way to get our work out there, but also to get faster feedback on our research, which is very critical. So right now, as well as submitting your paper to a journal for consideration, you can also post your preprint online. You can share your research process and get feedback via blog posts, via Twitter, via all forms of social media, and as well as getting your work out there. More importantly, you can get feedback on your work much quicker. Peer review is fallible. Quite often you hear arguments against preprints going, well, preprints aren't great because they're not peer reviewed. But peer review through the traditional system isn't a guarantee of quality either. So I think it's important to get as much feedback and as many eyes as possible on publications that we can, because 2 or 3 reviewers might miss a crucial error. But with preprints and with open science and with social media, there are ways that you can share research and get immediate feedback on your work. So I want to give a story of this paper. This is a paper I published a number of years ago, and this all started as a tweet. I did a tweet thread explaining, I found this really cool tool. I thought, wow, Bayesian hypothesis testing is a really interesting way that we can get more information about non-significant tests. Our current way of doing null hypothesis significance testing, if you get a non-significant p-value, this is not informative, because it can either mean that your data was insensitive, or it can either be support for a null model. But there's no way of knowing this, despite this, even a very large p-value doesn't tell you this information. So I came across a number of years ago Bayesian hypothesis testing, and I thought this is a fantastic way of actually getting information about the null. If you're interested, check out the paper, but that's not the whole point. So essentially, I wrote a thread going, hey, this is really interesting, and I got a lot of great feedback. And by thinking out loud, by using social media to think out loud, I was able to get feedback on that there was general interest in this. And then this turned into a preprint, and I submitted that preprint that also got a lot of fantastic feedback. And some of it was negative in that I'd done a few things that were wrong. And although that sort of stung a little bit, it's never nice being told that you're wrong. It ultimately made the paper a lot better. And one of the co-authors, it was actually the co-author in this paper was actually one of those people, and he had a lot of great feedback. That was so good, I actually invited him on the paper. And none of these things would have happened if I wasn't transparent with the process, if I didn't start talking about it, and if I didn't preprint that. I got amazing fast feedback on this particular work because I was able to share it online. And those are some of the great benefits that you get by practicing open science and by putting all your work out there, the analysis was also open and posted that people can go through and they notice, well, you've done this thing, but have you considered doing these other analyses? With the traditional way of publication, where you're not sharing scripts and you're not sharing data, no one can do that. No one can check these things. But if you are sharing your data and sharing your process and being transparent in that way, then people can comment on your work there. One of the more sort of common complaints I get is like, well, that's all fine and good if you post a preprint, but what if you get no one commenting on your work? And yeah, that's happened. There's been a few times where I posted a preprint and I've got no feedback, whereas there's been other times where I posted feedback, like in this situation where I've got a lot of feedback. It's just as simple as asking people. So, for instance, if there's a part of the preprint where I'm not sure about, I'll just reach out to the authors going, hey, I've written this thing, I've cited your paper or I've cited your idea. If you have the time, it'd be great if you could read that section of the paper. And every single time that happens, people are very interested in making sure that their work is interpreted correctly. Perhaps there's many of you listening right now who have had their work cited and they're curious to see how it's been cited, and they've noticed it's been cited the completely wrong way. So if people get the opportunity to see how their work's been cited, people are very likely to help you out in that way. And this is amazing. This sort of thing would simply not be possible using the old publication system. But now that we have preprints and open scripts and open data, we can actually do those things. I've been using Facebook for quite a long time. I started using it when it was only available to university addresses. I don't think it was this old when I started using it, but the thing about Facebook is it's been iterated. The design and how it works has been iterated thousands and thousands and thousands of times. Right now, there's thousands of different versions of Facebook out there with parameters slightly tweaked, so they can actually see essentially how long can we keep you on the website. And every single social media platform does exactly the same thing. They're constantly getting quick feedback in order to improve what they're doing in order to help their metrics, which in that case is how long are you spending on their website. And so they're continually testing these new features in order to get quick learning. So I think within academia, it's so good now that we have this opportunity that we can do exactly the same thing. We have this old model where feedback takes forever, but now with open science and with social media, there are ways that we can get this immediate feedback rather than waiting a couple of years to actually judge the impact of a paper. We can get feedback almost straight away on the proviso that our work is open. Okay, so to get a little bit more practical, I want to talk about ways that you can share your data openly while maintaining the privacy of your research participants. There's a lot of benefits for open data. It benefits society in terms of the what we've learned scientifically. It's also beneficial to the economy as well for actually learning things about the world. And with open data, it's what's really great about it is that other researchers can actually verify the results of what's been shared, but they can also generate new hypotheses. As you would know, it's very resource intensive to collect data. But if other people have collected data in ways that you could potentially use, if there's open data, you can actually go in there and analyze the data and generate new hypotheses for your own work. And then you can form new hypotheses as well. So there's a lot of benefits for having open data. But like I said, we have to consider participant privacy, especially for some conditions where people just don't want to reveal personal information. Of course, there's stuff where people are like, yeah, I don't mind if you post my ice cream preferences, but for other people, for certain disorders, or for other things, people don't want to share their personal information, and that's totally understandable. We have to think about these things. So we have these two competing ideas: utility as how we can actually make the most use out of a data set, but also disclosure protection. We have to protect people who don't want their data shared. If you have a complete open data set, you have very high utility, people can use it, but very little disclosure protection. And this also includes, of course, when people posting data, no one's posting names, but it's very easy to identify people if you have age or if you have location. It doesn't take that much information to actually identify people. So even if you think you're stripping data away, then it's still there's still some risks there. But then you also have disclosure protection. So you can have a closed data set, which is great because you're almost guaranteeing participant privacy, but there's no utility. No one else can use the data because all you're sharing is the summary data. So maybe it can be used for meta-analysis and it might be useful in that way, but it's much more useful if the raw data is out there. So we have these sort of two sides of the coin which we have to navigate. Some traditional ways, like I've said before, like if you think that you remove some bits of data, you think you can actually maintain privacy, but it's still possible to identify individuals with a few bits and pieces of data. Some people have tried aggregating sensitive variables. So rather than having age as a continuous variable, they might say people between the ages of 20 and 30, for instance. So this does help in reducing risk, but it also reduces the utility of the data because it's much better in that previous example. It's much better to treat age as a continuous variable if you can, rather than binning it. So you're increasing the disclosure protection, but you're also decreasing utility. Other people have tried adding random noise to the data set, but people have been able to figure that out and get around that and still identify people. So as well as making your data a little bit worse, you're also still putting people at risk. So these have been the ways that people have tried. So the question is, can we actually increase utility while maintaining privacy? And you can. The answer is yes, and you can do that through synthetic data. And this is a data set which shares or mimics the statistical properties of the original data set, while still while having none of the individuals have exactly the same information. So you have this data set of synthetic people that if you run the same analysis, you're going to get almost the same, or if not the same results. But at the same time, not a single person can actually be identified. So you're getting the best of both worlds. You're getting data which is high utility. Other people can use it. Other people can verify your analysis with that. But you've also got very high disclosure protection, and that is very, very difficult, or it's almost impossible for people to identify participants based on the data that's there. And this is applied using a really cool name R package called synthpop. And if you think, oh, I don't know how to use R, or I'm not very good at R, this is a very, very straightforward package to use. So even if you're a beginner, you still will be able to use it. So don't let this put you off if you think this is an R package. It is, compared to other R packages, this is very, very straightforward to use. So to give you an example, we have here our observed data set with a few different variables, very typical stuff: age, sex, education, marital status, income, a mix of categorical variables and continuous variables. And you can create a synthetic data set which scrambles everything. Yet the most important things is that the frequencies and the averages and standard deviations remain almost exactly the same, and the relationships between variables also remains very, very similar to the original data set as well. So it's not only the means and the frequencies, but it's also the relationships between variables as well, which is very important for when you're doing exploratory analysis. So with this synthetic data set, so here's the sort of scenario that you would have, which a number of people have begun doing within the medical and the psychological sciences. You can say, okay, we would have liked to have shared our data. However, we couldn't because of the personal nature of the data. That's fair enough. However, here is our synthetic data set where you can recreate the analysis. So you can do this and you can reproduce the analysis based on the synthetic data set. And more importantly, you can explore the data and you can generate new hypotheses based on the data as well. And I don't want to say that disclosure risk is zero, because it's hard to provide that guarantee. But right now, currently, to our best knowledge, right now, people haven't been able to identify participants based on synthetic data. It's very hard to know what's going to happen in the future. But right now, this is the most secure version that we have, in which we can also have high data utility as well. There are two conditions which may affect or which may increase the risk of disclosure. That's if there is a replicated set of values. So say you had four variables: marital status, occupation, sex, and age. If you have a few sets of variables and an enormous data set, it's very likely that there is going to be some replicated pairs of values. And this could potentially erode the trust in the data set, because somebody might look at the data, a participant going, oh, that's me. And even though it's not them, because it's all been scrambled, they may still think that their data is out there. So that's one potential problem. And the second problem is extreme individual values. So, say I was doing research in the autism population within southeastern Norway, and I had one participant who was 45 and male and who was born overseas. That's a very extreme value for the population and potentially very easy to identify. So that's another potential issue there. And I'm going to talk about ways that we can potentially get around that. So it's really important to recognize that for all these new methods, there are some limitations. So it's important to be cognizant of these limitations. So here is a paper explaining synthpop and how it works. Essentially, it just uses one main function to create this synthetic data. And think of it, it works much in the same way like multiple imputation, in that it replaces all or some of the data by sampling from a probability distribution. And it uses a procedure which was developed in the 90s as well, but there's a number of different options if you want to dig in there. But the defaults that are used within the package work quite well across a most range of scenarios. So the two things to establish when you're working with synthetic data is general utility, and it's overall similarities in the data set. And the second one is specific utility. So how can I recreate the analyses that I've reported with my original data set with the synthetic data set? So that's like analytical reproducibility. Okay, so in terms of general utility, here is an example that I've used within my tutorial data set. We have oxytocin and placebo, and you can see the counts between the observed data, which is light blue, and the synthetic data, which is dark blue. You can also see age as well. So across, I mean, of course, there are some differences because it's not exactly the same, but there's a lot of similarities. Within this particular data set, this was actually an experiment which looked at whether the question, does intranasal oxytocin increase feelings of spirituality? That was the research question. So that's why there is a spirituality question here. And there's also a question in terms of religious affiliation. So these are the main four variables that we're dealing with. And you can see that there's a high general utility in that the frequencies for all these variables were very similar. So it's always good to eyeball these things when you're creating your synthetic data set. And the other thing that you need to do is you need to convert in order to actually test the specific utility of your models, in that, do I get the same results doing the analysis on the synthetic data set versus the original data set? You need to convert your analysis, if it isn't already, into a linear model. And for a t-test, for instance, it's very straightforward to do this. Now, I want to share with you one thing that blew my mind when I discovered this, and I can't believe it wasn't taught in my entire undergraduate statistics, and that is every single common statistical test is actually a linear model. There's a really great website which goes through this, but once you once you understand this, this really really helps get a conceptualization of statistics, in that every single common statistical test, ANOVAs, t-tests, correlations are essentially linear models. So when you're doing this for synthpop, or when you're doing this for your analysis, you're doing these conversions into linear models in order to test the specific utility. So what you're doing is you're essentially comparing the confidence intervals and the estimates between your synthetic model and your observed model. So if you have high specific utility, you would actually want these models to have a high amount of overlap. So here we have these three different analyses for looking for this particular analysis, and you can see there is a high degree of crossover, so that doing the same analysis based on the original data set versus the synthetic data set gives you the same outcome. So if someone was to rerun your analysis, they would get a result which is very, very similar. So within this particular analysis, there was no replicated data sets. So part of the analysis, when you're doing this within synthpop, it'll tell you how many of the individuals, whether there was any replications there, and if there is, you can essentially rerun your synthesis. Of course, if you had, you can rerun your synthesis using a different seed. if you have 100 replicated data sets, choosing a different seed isn't magically going to give you 0. But if you have sort of 3, maybe if you choose a different seed, then you can get that down to 0. So it's important to check how many replicated data sets that you have. There was also good general utility. So eyeballing the frequencies, we could see that things were very similar. And there are specific statistical tests that you can do to compare the models. So there's a lack of fit test comparing the models there, and in this particular example, it was non-significant. And then you can also look at the percentage overlap between these confidence intervals. So there's a statistical test, and you can also note that here, at least in this example, there was 87.8% confidence interval overlap as well. So when you're actually doing your paper, you can report, here is our synthetic data set, and here is the specific and the general utility as well. So people, when they're reanalyzing your data, get a better understanding of the data that they're working with. I also tested this because I was very curious to see under what conditions this would hold. This particular oxytocin study was like 100 participants and a couple of variables, and the data was fairly normal and behaved quite nicely. So I wanted to test to see whether it made a difference, whether your variables are skewed, whether there's missing data, which happens a lot in research, there was no difference. It performed very well, regardless of the percentage of missing data and the type of skew that you had, as well as the sample sizes as well. So even I think this ranges from 100 to 10,000. It seems to work quite nicely for sharing your data. If you're interested, I posted an online version of this analysis, which is part of the paper. So this actually loads up R within your browser. You don't even have to install R. So you can run all this analysis yourself to replicate everything which was described in this paper without having to worry about the versions. Because this was published about 2 years ago. And as we know, R and packages can update as well. So you can run this all by yourself if you follow the links to the paper. One thing I do want to mention is that a lot of times in research, we assume that participants don't want to share their data, so we don't even ask them. But there's been a few surveys where people have actually asked participants, are you okay with sharing your data as long as we take reasonable precautions to remove identifiable information? And most people are totally fine. Most people who have certain disorders are very interested in actually making sure that their people get answers for treatment. So people are more willing than you would think to share their data in a lot of circumstances. So, of course, synthetic data is really a solution for when you can't get permission to share your data. And the most ideal thing is in the planning stages of your analysis to actually include within your IRB application the permission to actually ask participants, are you okay with us sharing your data and getting that written permission from participants? Because if you can do that, then that saves you a whole bunch of headaches for actually creating these synthetic data sets. So while you're planning your studies, put this in your IRB applications and actually ask your participants, because you'll probably be surprised in many circumstances for people's willingness to share their data. Okay, so I think synthetic data can get around 2 of the most common objections with sharing data and with having open data. The first one being we need to respect participant privacy, which is legitimate. I'm not saying this is not a problem. It absolutely is a legitimate problem, but synthetic data can get around that because you can still get the benefits of open data by reproducing analysis and allowing other people to test new hypotheses based on your data while still maintaining participant privacy. The second one, which is I think a bit of a trickier one, is a lot of people say, well, I don't want to share my data because this is part of a PhD project and there's 2 more papers coming out of this data. I don't want people to take the data and do something. We want first dibs on this data set. I think that's quite legitimate because data is quite resource intensive. But the good thing about synthetic data is that if you're sharing this publicly, people can't publish based on synthetic data sets because it's not real. It's not the exact same data set as the real data set. So people can actually replicate data and test hypotheses, but they can't use the data for themselves. The only way they can actually use data is one scenario is a researcher might get a hypothesis based on a synthetic data set, go back to the original authors just going, hey, I found this thing. Can you confirm this on your real data to see if you get the same sort of thing. If your data has high general utility, then you should get the same sort of thing. But then this actually also almost forces collaboration between the researcher who's doing exploratory analysis versus the original authors, because they can't actually publish or do anything with the synthetic data beyond exploration. So it's a nice way to get around this problem of, I don't want to share my data because I'm going to be doing more analysis on it. A final thing that I want to note is that people see all these new innovations in open science and reproducibility and think that's fine and all, but that's going to take me a lot of time. And I agree, these things do take time, but all you're doing is you're redirecting where that time is spent. If you're doing your projects using reproducible practices, taking that extra bit of time, you're simply relocating where you're spending that time. So don't be daunted looking at these things going, oh, I don't know how I can fit this all in. It's going to delay my project. In my experience and in the experience of colleagues, these projects take the same amount of time, if not quicker, but all that happens is you're redirecting where that time is spent. Okay, so I'm really looking forward to getting into some questions and discussing open research practices within clinical research. But before I do that, I just want to point out some free resources that may be of interest. The first one is a book that I wrote last year, Twitter for Scientists. It shows you how you can use Twitter to boost your scientific career. Twitter and social media has completely changed my career. If it wasn't for that, I don't even think I'd still be in research. But I got on Twitter about a decade ago, and it's been an enormous help for me in terms of building collaborations and learning new things. And it's just a lot of fun. So if you're interested in how to do that for your career, I'll check out this free book, t4scientists.com. I also do a lot of podcasting talking about these issues in open science and reproducibility. And I would love to see more people getting into this space. So I've written this guide. It's this free online guide as to how to get started with podcasting with almost zero budget. So if this is something that's interested you, check this out and you can see how to get started and some tips for podcasting. So yeah, I'm going to wrap this up. Find me online. I would love to take questions now, but if you have any questions afterwards, please get in touch. But yes, thank you for your attention, and let's talk open science.